Hi, my name is Jared, and this is Horror Obsession. Today, Slasher School continues. With the discussion of the villains. The slasher in these movies is much more famous than any other character, essentially the Eminem in D12 or Kim Kardashian in Kim Yi. The villain is also the one who makes an appearance in every movie in the franchise. For example, Leatherface is the only character who has been in all of the Texas Chainsaw movies, and look no further than the outrage that followed Halloween 3 to see why this is the case. The makers of Halloween wanted to turn the franchise into an anthology series which was tied together by different Halloween plots, so the third movie tells a totally different story about a mask-making company and did not feature Michael Myers. Audiences were pissed, and nowadays suggesting to studio execs that you should make a Halloween movie without Michael Myers would rightfully get you laughed out of the studio. So why do we have such a fascination with the slasher villains? I mean, I support them because I hate all people and want them to suffer, but my understanding is this is an unpopular opinion, so why do most people support the villains? The answer is complicated, and rather than focusing on why the final girl is more forgettable, hint, it's because they are almost all interchangeable, I want to focus on what makes slasher villains so memorable. First, let's talk about what characteristics these murder maestros share, and then focus in on the most iconic villains to see what separates them from the lesser, more forgettable slashers. Slashers must have some kind of iconic weapon, a point about as obvious as it being a bad idea to build a relationship on the foundation of promoting each other's brands. Freddy has his finger knives, Michael has his butcher knife, Jason has his machete, Ghostface uses a knife, and Leatherface of course has his chainsaw. Even the lesser known slashers such as Rust Thorn from Slumber Party Massacre has his drill, the Prowler has his gardening fork, and Harry Warden, aka the Miner, uses a pickaxe. The function of the weapon is to help the audience identify the killer, since as you can see, there are countless slasher villains, and with such crowded company it can be easy to forget who is who. Kind of like how it is easy to mix up Kim Yi's kids. I think the one on the right is Northwest, then Chicago West is in green, and Saint West has a Chicago necklace on. No, wait. That one is Chicago West. Saint West must be the one that looks like Jaden Smith, which makes Psalm West the one that looks like Sharon Stone from Basic Instinct. So anyway, as you may remember from my What is a Slasher Movie video, one of the core elements that makes these movies slashers at all is having a human villain that uses some kind of bladed weapon. If the villain is a monster, such as a shark, xenomorph, or predator, the movie is probably more of a monster movie even if the rest of the elements for a slasher are there. The slasher genre really got started with Psycho, and then further defined by Black Christmas, Peeping Tom, Halloween, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think one of the reasons bladed weapons became the go-to weapons for these villains is it adds a level of intimacy to the kills that makes them even more disturbing. You don't have to be Sigmund Freud to notice a subtext of rape in these movies, as there is a hulking man penetrating a bunch of young women with his weapon, never more notable than in Slumber Party Massacre, where the aforementioned Rust Thorn is literally trying to drill naked young women. Even ignoring this subtext, however, just watch these two scenes side by side and tell me which feels more intimate.
Sam Rapp.
Thank you.
Clearly this stabbing death is more intimate and subsequently more disturbing. This goes back to something I talk about in my Psychology of Fear video, which is combining multiple different forms of fear is always scarier. There is the fear of pain and dying, aka mutilation, but also the fear of being violated, aka loss of autonomy. Having the villain wield a bladed weapon adds to this fear substantially, and also allows the director to drag out these scenes, forcing the captive audience to watch as some poor victim gets stabbed or slashed over over and over again, activating those mirror neurons and making us squirm in our seats, the same way Kanye squirms whenever he sees a yellow tangfish on screen. Just make sure they don't use a gun, otherwise you end up essentially writing the villain in your movie out of the slasher genre entirely. These movies can work, obviously, since Terminator is pretty much a sci-fi slasher where the villain uses guns instead of bladed weapons, but guns kill quickly and don't give you much time to twist the knife, both into your victims and into the audience. Another obvious characteristic that used to be more true than it is now is the villain was almost always male. This speaks, once again, to the in-your-face subtext most slashers have about violation, but also because many of these scenes involve the killers doing something which would be difficult to believe with a female villain. Look, I'm not saying it's impossible, it just takes away from the immersion, which is the opposite of what you want when making a horror movie. Look, I know what you're thinking.
But Jared, you fuck. Jason's mother is the killer in the original Friday the 13th, and the Scream franchise has multiple female antagonists, and those movies are good slashers, so obviously you're wrong.
Well, in all of those examples, the reveal that the antagonist is a woman comes at the very end of the film, and is notable specifically because the entire movie, the audience is operating under the assumption they are a male. And honestly, on rewatch, sometimes it does take you out of the film a little bit, imagining some 5'5" grandma trying to move these kids' dead bodies around. The third and final commonly shared characteristic of these slashers is the mask. Norman Bates got this trend started by wearing his mother suit, and Leatherface wears, well, a human face. Just like Mark Zuckerberg. Leatherface was loosely based on Ed Gein, who somewhat notoriously ate his victims, but somewhat less notoriously would wear their faces as a mask. Lovely guy. Ed Gein, not Zuckerberg. Michael Myers wears the Shatner mask, and Jason originally wears a bag over his head, but transitions to the iconic hockey mask by the third movie. Ghostface wears the entire costume, which is a nice twist, and apparently they came up with the idea for the costume while location scouting. There was a costume randomly in one of the buildings, and they thought it was creepy, so they bought the rights to it and went for it, serendipitously creating one of the most iconic villains of all time. But what does the mask actually add to the character? One core tenet of fear is the unknown is scarier than the known. Imagine hearing a strange sound down in the basement, and because you are in real life and not a horror movie, you decide to go investigate. Peering down into the dark basement, you have no idea what could have gone bump in the night. Is it a ghost? A rat? Kylie Jenner? Your imagination creates possibilities which are uniquely scary to you, in a way which is impossible to replicate once the nature of the sound is discovered. Once you turn on the lights and you find out what it is, virtually no matter what it is, your fear will be reduced. The same concept applies to horror villains. You want the villain to have some backstory, but over-explaining their motivations is a disastrous decision which should be avoided at all costs. Kind of like marrying a malignant narcissist.
I am the #1 most impactful artist of our generation. I am Shakespeare in the flesh. Walt Disney,
Nike, Google.
Hannibal Lecter is a polite, hyper-intelligent cannibal psychopath. We understand his desire to get to know Clarice's psychology because he is fascinated with the human mind. But the reason he eats people is never explained, nor should it have been. Allowing the specific cause of his psychopathology to go unexplained is a major reason why he remains one of, if not the, best horror villain of all time. The later Halloween movies try to explain what is going on with Michael, much to the franchise's detriment, and almost immediately ignore it for the remainder of the franchise. The first Halloween plays it perfectly, allowing the audience to know Michael kills his family when he is a child but does not say why, then doesn't even begin to explain his motivations for the rest of his killing spree. The use of the mask helps to keep the villain mysterious and unknowable, and therefore much more scary. This is never more clear than when a slasher villain doesn't have a mask, even if the motivations of the killer are not explained. I think Slumber Party Massacre is a great example of this, as the killer's motivations are explored only at the most superficial level. But he does not have a mask, the end result being most of the scenes of him trying to act crazy end up looking kind of comical. Compare these two scenes side by side to see what I mean. last thing I'll say about The Mask is that it turns a killer into something more than a man. It turns him into an idea. Michael Myers is referenced as the Shape in the original Halloween, and is also at times referred to as the Boogeyman. Leatherface doesn't take on quite as much of a supernatural quality, but Jason absolutely does. The best example of this, I think, however, is Ghostface. Spoiler if you've never seen the franchise, but the original Scream is old enough to have voted in 2 presidential elections, so I think it's fair game at this point. Ghostface is more than one killer, a great subversion of expectations, but as the franchise moves along, different characters start to take over the role of Ghostface. While we refer to the character as Ghostface, there have been no less than 8 characters who have inhabited the role at different times, with presumably another 2 coming in Scream 5. Despite this, I feel like it is appropriate to refer to the character in the singular, since the character is basically the ghost of Sidney Prescott's past and embodies the idea of her and her family's transgressions coming back to haunt her. A big part of why Russ Thorne doesn't work is they make the mistake of having him be maskless, which not only puts a much bigger burden for acting on Michael Villela, but also makes him feel smaller and more easily defeated. He is just a man, after all. One incredibly iconic character which falls somewhere in the middle is Freddy Krueger. He doesn't have a traditional mask, he has the burned face. This allows him to have facial expressions, and as a result, the character ends up devolving into more of a jokester as the franchise moved along, starting mostly with Dream Warriors and becoming a parody of himself by Dream Child. Chucky was in the same boat since he is a serial killer inside of a doll, so we get the doll's facial expressions, and as a result, he ends up becoming more comedic than the typical slasher villain. The lesson here is if you want your villain to be scary, go for the mask look. If you want the villain to be scary and comedic, go for some middle ground, but definitely don't go for just a regular guy's face. This is the least effective and most difficult to pull off look. I'm not saying it's impossible, but unless you've got Anthony Hopkins in your lead role, it probably will end up backfiring. Alright, so most slasher villains have an iconic bladed weapon to slash with, are physically imposing, and have their faces obscured to add to their mysterious nature. I mentioned before that keeping the villain's motivation close to the chest is generally a good idea, since over-explaining can undermine the fear by turning the unknown into the known. The best slashers manage to have some kind of personal connection between the villain and the final girl, however, such as Nancy being the daughter of the woman who burned Freddy to death, but also captured perfectly while Leslie Vernon is building his legacy in Behind the Mask.
What is that?
This is an article about the suspect who was questioned in the rape of my mom.
Mark Daniel Curtis.
Mm-hmm.
Is he related to Kelly?
It's her great uncle. Well, supposedly.
Wow, he looks just like her.
It is her. It's computer-generated image. Pretty good, huh? She doesn't have a great uncle, or at least not that I know of.
So what, you made that up?
A lot of what we use is CGI.
Laurie has explained to be Michael's sister in the second movie, though whether this is a good decision or not is kind of up in the air.
Wasn't it her brother who, cold-blooded mutilated all those teenagers?
No. That's just a bit that some people made up to make him feel better, I think.
Leatherface just butchers anyone who wanders onto their property, and the chaotic randomness of that is more terrifying for me, personally. The idea that the killer is obsessed with you and will continue to haunt you forever is definitely terrifying in its own right, adds more intimacy, and provides the killer some motivation which can help flesh out the villain, a useful tool especially if the goal is to create a franchise. Along with the personal connection to the final girl, another characteristic I think is okay to do either way is whether the villain talks. Freddy is notorious for being a wisecracking asshole, but Michael, Jason, and Leatherface all don't talk, and for me, this makes them scarier. I absolutely think you can create a perfectly fine slasher movie with a talking villain. In fact, one of the core elements of Ghostface is that he talks to you on the phone, and the Scream franchise is perhaps my favorite franchise overall. Writing dialogue is pretty hard, however, and writing scary dialogue is even harder, so for the most part I think slasher writers would be wise to go with the silent killer and rely primarily on visuals for the scares instead of words. A lovely little slasher movie I adore named Hatchet does this with its villain, Victor Crowley, and the result is a slasher film beloved by most slasher fanatics. If you are going to use a backstory to the villain, you should combine this with an early starting gun so the final girl and her friends can investigate the motivation behind the killings while the rest of the killings take place. The introduce the horror scene to start the movie off will then naturally become the inciting incident for the story, and the rest practically writes itself. The characters try to figure out why they are being picked off one by one, while a villain picks them off one by one, culminating in them figuring out the secret in time to save one or two of them. This is used in Nightmare on Elm Street and all of the Scream movies, and it is not a coincidence those movies are widely regarded as among the best slashers of all time. Overall, slasher villains are arguably the protagonists of many of their movies. Whether they are adding insult to injury or relying primarily on injury, it is probably best to keep their face hidden to elevate the fear from fear of an individual mortal person to fear of a larger-than-life abstract idea. For example, fear that beneath the surface people don't respect you, so you spend your whole life seeking out more and more attention and accumulating money to try and prove to everyone you're worth something, only to get called a gay fish in a hobbit by some stoners from Colorado. Make sure the villains have some kind of iconic weapon that is not a gun, and try to keep the backstory to a minimum. If you do use a backstory, keep it personal to the final girl and use it to flesh out the villain, and try to use the backstory as a way to give the characters something to do while the slashings occur. Next up is the final video of Slasher School, which appropriately will take a look at the final girl.